We're now moving to 5-minute closing speeches. Timekeeper, are you ready? Okay, begin.
In my closing statement, I'd like to try to draw together some of the threads of the debate and see if we can come to some conclusions. First, I argued that God, if he exists, provides the sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. By the time of his last rebuttal, the only argument that I heard Dr. Harris offering against this position is to say that you're merely defining God as good, which is the same fallacy I accused him of committing. I don't think this is the case at all. God is a being worthy of worship. Any being that is not worthy of worship is not God. And therefore, God must be perfectly good and essentially good. More than that, as Anselm saw, God is the greatest conceivable being. And therefore, he is the very paradigm of goodness itself. He is the greatest good. So once you understand the concept of God, you can see that asking, well, why is God good, is sort of like asking, why are all bachelors unmarried? It's the very concept of the greatest conceivable being, a being worthy of worship, that entails the essential goodness of God. And I think it's evident that if God exists, then we do have objective moral values and duties. Secondly, I argued, if God does not exist, we have no foundation for objective moral values or objective moral duties. I showed that on his view, it is logically impossible to say that the moral landscape is identical to the landscape of the flourishing of conscious beings, and that therefore his view is incoherent. We also looked at the is-ought distinction, and the ought implies can, to which Dr. Harris has never replied in the course of this evening's debate. In his last speech, he said, but we simply must rely upon certain axioms. Well, that's the same as saying you've got to take it by faith. And if these axioms are moral axioms, then I think he's admitting my point, that on atheism, there simply is no ground for believing the objectivity of moral values and duties. He just takes them by a leap of faith. He says, well, there are different senses of the word objective. Yes, of course, and in my opening speech, I made clear the sense in which I was defining the term. I mean valid and binding, independent of human opinion. And moral values are not objectively binding and valid in that way on atheism. He says science can study subjective facts. For example, pain is a subjective fact. Granted, that's certainly true. So my question is the wrongness of an action a subjective fact? On atheism, it's hard to see how it couldn't be anything more than a subjective fact, in which case you cannot say, as Dr. Harris wants to say, and I agree with him, that the genital mutilation of little girls is objectively wrong, not just a subjective opinion. He says, well, but if you're psychopathic or neurotic, there's something wrong with you. Granted, I agree with that. There is something wrong with you. But the question is, on atheism, if atheism were true, would there be anything objectively morally wrong with doing what the psychopath does? He hasn't been able to show that. Indeed, there are no moral duties on his view. And remember, he himself admitted that psychopaths could occupy the peaks of well-being on his so-called moral landscape, and that therefore it is not a moral landscape at all. To conclude, I want to quote from a remarkable article that appeared in the Duke Law Journal by Arthur Allen Leff called Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Law. Dr. Leff's difficulty is the same as Dr. Harris's. He wants to find a foundation for moral values and duties, in this case for the law, that would be independent of human opinion, would be objective and would be in the world, and he can't find one. He says, any attempt to ground values in the world is open to the playground bully's retort, who says? And this is how his article concludes. All I can say is this: it looks as if we are all we have. Only if ethics were something unspeakable by us, that is, something transcendent, could law be unnatural and therefore unchallengeable. As things now stand, everything is up for grabs. Nevertheless, napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in the world such a thing as evil. All together now, says who? God help us.